In the most recent Pentagon and All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office reporting cycle for FY24, some researchers point to a single ambiguous paragraph that stands out. Its wording, they argue, echoes older and highly disputed transcripts from the EBA1 interrogations between 1947 and 1952. In those circles, the phrase has been nicknamed the First Order, an alleged administrative network said to govern contact protocols. Here's the striking allegation. Some whistleblowers claim those protocols apply to scores, or even hundreds, of inhabited systems. That claim is extraordinary and remains unverified. We'll treat extraordinary claims as claims and show what's verified and what isn't. If proven true, it would suggest that many of the credible UAP cases logged in 2024 were not random. So what would that kind of mission look like, and why might it be time now? Why 2024 was the most documented year for UAPs on record. Through the ARRO's latest reporting cycle for FY24, covering May 1st, 2023 to June 1st, 2024, the numbers tell their own story. In that period, the office received 757 new UAP reports, bringing its cumulative case total to 1,652. Of the fresh reports, 118 were resolved, often as balloons, drones, or other identifiable sources, while 21 remained under deeper analysis. Those figures don't suggest confirmation of anything extraordinary on their own, but they do mark a year of unusually dense reporting. The quality of some of these cases also set 2024 apart. Many were supported by corroborating radar tracks, synchronized flight telemetry, and in certain instances, high-resolution imagery captured from multiple observation points. For example, ARRO has publicly posted detailed reconstructions of incidents such as the Puerto Rico object from Aguadilla, as well as the Go Fast and Gimbal videos, cases the office now attributes to sensor artifacts or conventional aircraft behavior. Others, like select infrared captures from the MT Etna case set, remain unresolved under the same disclosure framework. This combination, large numbers, extensive sensor coverage, and the persistence of a small unexplained fraction, is why the year stands out in the eyes of analysts. By mid-year, the accumulation of credible reports was shaping operational priorities. Multispectrum detection assets, including military-grade sensors and surveillance satellites, were retasked toward areas showing recurrent events. Some of these sectors had been dormant in prior years, but suddenly returned clusters of sightings within short time frames. Parallel monitoring groups in France, Japan, and Chile reported comparable trends in their own datasets, reinforcing the perception that something was changing globally rather than locally. Within that dense mix of cases, certain patterns shaped the classified narrative. A portion of the unresolved events took place over restricted military ranges or along the perimeter of sensitive maritime zones. In one instance, trained observers described a sharply angled object holding absolute position against high crosswinds. Ground-based trackers confirmed its stability, while aircraft attempting to close distance encountered instrumentation disruptions and were forced to pull back. The event was recorded in multiple modalities, but yielded no official explanation. Another late-year example in a Pacific naval operations zone spanned nearly 20 minutes of observation. Sensors recorded optical, infrared, and radar data, coinciding to show the object tracing the zone's perimeter before rapidly departing into poorly monitored low-altitude airspace over the ocean. The flight path seemed almost to acknowledge the boundary without breaching it, a detail some analysts flagged as more indicative of intent than happenstance. Technical teams noted that electronic interference during these more complex encounters occurred only for the exact duration of proximity. The absence of lingering disruptions suggested a controlled effect rather than an incidental byproduct of propulsion technology. With similar signatures turning up across separate incidents, the hypothesis of coordinated, or at least consistently patterned activity began to circulate inside briefings. In the latter part of the year, an internal classification marker, Protocol-Relevant Events, made its appearance in interagency communications. The criteria for assigning this tag were not made public, but cases carrying it often featured deliberate movement near sensitive areas, consistent time windows, and sudden departure once those windows closed. While the meaning of protocol remained compartmentalized, those briefed on it understood it in terms of structured interaction rather than accidental overflight. A European aerospace monitoring team found that over half of their logged incidents in the final quarter matched a distinct trio of traits: deliberate navigation within proximity to restricted zones, geometries inconsistent with aerodynamic necessity, and departure after fixed durations. This level of repetition was atypical in the historical record, leading some specialists to suggest either a shift in operational posture or a new phase in established behavior. Without waiting for complete annual reviews, certain defense planners acted on those impressions. Surveillance of maritime choke points intensified, and early warning arrays were recalibrated to pick up faint indicators of pending appearances. Orbital and ground-based optical systems were reset for broader spectral capture with minimal lead time. The intent was to record these encounters in greater detail, whether their origins proved mundane or not. Meanwhile, independent civilian radar watchers began to match military-detected events with unusual speed. In earlier years, there was often a significant lag before open-source data reflected an officially mentioned incident. By late 2024, that gap had shrunk dramatically, sometimes to just hours, raising the possibility that these events were either harder to mask or that certain data overlaps were being allowed to emerge into public view. Inside the restricted analysis channels, unresolved cases from 2024 began to be compared with similar archival files from decades past. This side-by-side review pulled forward references from earlier programs that had cautiously labeled some incidents as possible controlled contact, language that had not been used publicly. The resemblance between those older assessments and certain protocol-relevant cases was close enough to reopen long-shelved casework, including Cold War-era sightings near nuclear installations that shared the same flight and departure patterns. By year's end, summaries restricted to cleared audiences acknowledged that the 21 still unresolved cases were not the only factor of interest. It was their behavioral traits, interacting with known sensor coverage, avoiding certain protected cores yet skirting their edges, and shifting routes into blind spots, that drew consistent attention. Specialists noted that these flight decisions implied some awareness of how and when they were being observed. Even with these carefully logged anomalies, ARRO leadership made its public position explicit. The office had discovered no evidence of extraterrestrial beings, activity, or technology to date. That statement framed the official stance, even as behind closed doors the presence of unresolved, patterned events kept the analysis teams engaged. So more reports, better multi-sensor coverage, a small, stubborn fraction that remains unexplained. It was within this context, a year defined by sharp increases in reporting, concentrated clusters near sensitive zones, and the appearance of a new internal label, that attention began to focus elsewhere. Among the routine pages of an upcoming government report, a single understated paragraph stood out to those who knew what to look for. Its phrasing, quietly embedded between statistical tables and case summaries, would soon become the subject of intense and very private discussion. The paragraph that set investigators whispering. Among the material reviewed in recent public reporting and related classified summaries, one short, understated paragraph has become a flashpoint of debate. Buried among statistics and routine case notes, it used language that some analysts interpret as pointing to a formal administrative mechanism for managing planetary contact. The wording is deliberately vague. Those who have examined it closely split into two distinct camps, one that sees it as an accidental turn of bureaucratic phrasing, and another that suspects it was an intentional signal to readers familiar with certain historical references. We'll show what those making the claim point to, and what independent experts and official spokespeople say in response. ARRO has publicly stated it has found no evidence of extraterrestrial beings, activity, or technology, and the Department of Defense has echoed that position. What stands out is that this paragraph's phrasing departs from typical UAP reporting language, which usually avoids even the suggestion of formal governance behind unexplained aerial activity. A few researchers, particularly those versed in older, non-officially acknowledged case histories, have noted what they call wording resonance with material linked to the alleged EBA1 interrogations from 1947 to 1952, as circulated in secondary and fringe sources. In those sources, transcripts reference a governing structure coordinating contact between more advanced civilizations and developing planets. The English translations describe something akin to an administrative mechanism. Echoes like this are interesting, they are not proof. In those decades-old interpreter notes, the concept appears as part of a larger framework, an authority that decided both the timing and circumstances of contact, and could revoke it if certain conditions weren't met. The mechanics of such a system, if it existed, were never fleshed out. Modern readers drawing the parallel argue that the newer paragraph's use of mechanism is not arbitrary. They point out that mechanism implies a standing system, potentially self-sustaining, rather than a temporary project run by one nation. Others remain unconvinced, seeing no reason to read beyond the obvious fact that the term can surface in many unrelated contexts. The historical claim goes further. Some linguists working on the EBA1 material recorded that the original phrase might translate most closely into English as first order, with first meant in the sense of primary authority. This naming never entered the public domain in any official context and remained buried in non-mainstream literature. In the eyes of those in the intentional signal camp, seeing related terminology, even in sanitized form, appear in a government-released document is significant. To them, it marks the first time a concept linked to those old interrogation files has been allowed into the public version of contemporary reporting. Skeptics counter that such parallels may be the product of confirmation bias. Language in bureaucratic and technical domains often overlaps without implying shared origin. ARRO's consistent position, that nothing in its casework confirms non-human involvement, undercuts the more expansive interpretations. For these critics, the paragraph is at most a curiosity, an example of how ambiguous wording can attract disproportionate attention when grafted onto decades of contested history. Either way, that single paragraph has become a focal point, because language matters, and savvy readers know words can be used to signal without shouting. For some inside the analysis community, the juxtaposition of this phrase with unresolved UAP cases, particularly those tagged internally for their unusual characteristics, is worth noting. For others, it remains unremarkable, just another instance of a mundane term absorbing unintended weight. In intelligence and defense writing, subtle wording can serve several purposes. It can sow ambiguity to maintain deniability, prepare an audience for terms that may recur later, or create a public record that can be referenced without revealing classified specifics. Those reading intent into this phrasing see any of these scenarios as plausible, but again, without direct corroboration, such views are hypotheses, not established fact. Some in the signal camp extend their speculation further, suggesting the possibility that this wording could serve as a coded reference intended for counterparts in other agencies, or even for non-human parties said to be aware of the EBA1 discourse. If such continuity were real, it would imply a relationship persisting over decades under consistent terms. Others urge caution, noting how easily speculative threads can harden into untested narratives. International comparisons add another layer. Analysts have pointed out that certain foreign defense research documents, inaccessible to the public but described by those with clearance, feature similar formal descriptors. If those reports exist as claimed, and if the similarities are more than coincidental, the first order idea could belong to a shared vocabulary across multiple nations, whether that stems from common briefing materials, shared technical cooperation, or a mutual point of origin older than any modern government. For those convinced there is intent behind the paragraph, its presence in an open-source government release is meaningful. Even without elaboration or diagrams, it creates an anchor point for future public references. Lawmakers or consultants could now cite it without crossing classification boundaries, allowing incremental expansion of the conversation in official spaces. For others, the whole matter will fade once new reports arrive and public attention shifts to fresher cases. Still, the scrutiny won't disappear entirely. Researchers who see a link to the EBA1 narratives continue to mine old, disputed transcripts for any detail that might align with current phrasing. Skeptics will keep pointing to the ARRO denials and the absence of hard evidence. And amid that back and forth, the larger questions remain unresolved, not just about the paragraph's origin, but about whether any governance structure for contact exists at all. How those questions first arose, and why the same themes appear in historical material now being re-examined, is its own complex story. Understanding that background requires looking more closely at the circumstances under which EBA1 was kept, and how certain exchanges during that period hinted, at least to those willing to believe the parallels, at rules for interaction between worlds. What we missed about the EBA1 captivity case. The alleged EBA1 case, as it appears in interview accounts and fringe transcript collections, describes a period between 1947 and the spring of 1952 in which a non-human entity, was reportedly held insecure. Human custody. These narratives, circulated outside mainstream archival channels, claim EBA1 was moved between several facilities and subjected to a series of interrogations. What survives in the public sphere is incomplete. Fragments of typed transcripts, partial interpreter notes, and scattered administrative logs. Mainstream archives do not verify the chain of custody or even the authenticity of the source materials. Outside classified holdings, only partial, heavily redacted segments are accessible, making it impossible to assess the original scope without relying on secondary and often disputed sources. In these publicly available fragments, there are hints, never expanded on, of topics that go beyond biology or origin. Phrases like planetary agreements or assigned visitation terms appear without clarification. For decades, this absence of elaboration was chalked up to translation limits, the entity's own reticence, or the conditions under which the sessions took place. Yet some independent researchers note that cross-reference papers from contemporaneous offices list the question prompts, even when the answers are missing. Among those prompts are terms such as multi-system arrangement or hierarchy of contact authorization, language that, in hindsight, some link conceptually to more recent government phrasing about a planetary contact administrative mechanism. These links remain speculative. The partial logs suggest that separate session series may have been devoted to governance-type topics. In the alleged inventories, those sessions are described as longer or more tightly classified than those covering biology, craft operation, or cultural background. It is unclear whether those distinctions reflect actual sensitivity of content or simply the perceptions of whoever compiled the notes. In intelligence practice, high classification codes can be assigned for many reasons: protection of sources, ongoing operations, or simple bureaucratic caution. A few peripheral documents attributed to that era, such as interpreter schedules or movement orders, refer in plain terms to the subject's availability for questioning on zone allocation or intermediary command positions. Crucially, no related diagrams or detailed explanations survive in open archives. Where some fringe accounts claim EBA1 presented visual models of an interplanetary system, no reliable source in the public domain confirms their existence. Without chain of custody documentation or context, such details must remain unverified. One notable feature of these logs is the complete removal of responses to prompts marked with shorthand like GOVXT, allegedly meaning governance external to Earth. What remains are the prompts themselves, broad questions about higher-level leadership, decision-making across multiple inhabited systems, and enforcement of contact protocols, followed by blank space or generic, classified notations. The absence is conspicuous, but from a research standpoint, blank lines can mean many things: lost records, destroyed records, or withholding for reasons unrelated to extraterrestrial content. Because most of the public record consists of scaffolding, the format of questions, and the surrounding administrative traces, much of the analysis depends on inference. Researchers who endorse the authenticity of the material argue that the choice of terms lines up with their understanding of an alleged superplanetary council, sometimes referred to in modern discussions as the First Order. Skeptics counter that such phrasing is common in many organizational contexts and can't be taken as direct evidence of an actual interstellar hierarchy. The divide is stark. For some, this is the earliest recorded window into an organized authority above the planetary level. For others, it's an interesting but unsubstantiated textual pattern. Occasionally, a single marginal note receives outsized attention. In one ledger, a briefly legible phrase, reported to read protocol tiers, appears next to a reference to governance topics. Fringe literature interprets this as a rank status model for planets within an alleged oversight body. Open contact, observational monitoring, or intermediate exchange tiers without diplomatic parity. No corroboration exists in official or mainstream verified sources, and the meaning in the original context remains guesswork. As with other fragments, interpretation is colored by expectations and prior beliefs. The stronger claim made by proponents is not that the surviving notes prove the entity's statements, but that they indicate an official interest in mapping a structure of managed contact. In this reading, the recurrent governance prompts, high classification markings, and missing answer fields point to material considered operationally relevant, even if its factual basis could never be independently confirmed. To them, this continuity, stretching from alleged 1950s interviews to cautious 21st century wording, signals a long-standing awareness at some level of a regulating framework. The cautionary position is that parallels across decades can be coincidental, and bureaucratic language often converges on similar terms across unrelated fields. The absence of independent verification, the chain of custody gaps, and the heavy reliance on secondary sources all limit the historical weight of the EBA1 case. At best, what these materials offer are leads, slender lines of text that raise questions worth putting to verifiable sources, if those sources ever emerge. Nonetheless, within the investigative community that treats the EBA1 case as worthy of study, the fragments are seen as the earliest possible reference points for governance models in a multi-system context. Even without clear answers, the idea that such a conversation might have taken place, however imperfectly recorded or transmitted, keeps the case active in certain analytic circles. The very persistence of these scattered terms has encouraged some researchers to draw tentative conceptual maps, all marked as hypothetical, to compare with modern claims. Whether the EBA1 interviews, in whatever form they truly occurred, established any lasting human understanding of a so-called administrative mechanism is unknown. But the recurring themes, zones, authorizations, contact terms, are the same categories now referenced in recent accusations and testimonies. That recurrence is enough, for some, to justify continued scrutiny. It is against this backdrop of disputed transcripts and contested interpretations that later descriptions of a first order gain their traction. The connective tissue is circumstantial, but in the absence of new releases, it's what much of the discussion rests on. And for those willing to entertain that the hints point to a real, structured network managing interplanetary contact, the next logical question becomes, if such a network exists, what is its composition, and how is it said to operate? Inside the First Order's alleged administrative structure, some whistleblowers and leaked notes sketch what they describe as the First Order's administrative framework, portraying it less as a single species or governing block, and more as a managed network of positions and procedures spread across multiple star systems. In these accounts, its purpose is to regulate when, how, and under what conditions civilizations in earlier developmental stages are approached by those with spacefaring capabilities. The structure, according to these claims, is layered, with set roles and lines of reporting. Yet all of this remains speculative, drawn from restricted circulation material, alleged debrief summaries, and fringe transcript readings. Mainstream scientific and government voices caution that no verifiable physical evidence supports these organizational claims. The Pentagon and NASA both state they have found no proof of extraterrestrial material or governance systems. The alleged model begins with planetary delegates. In its simplest form, this role is described as a localized observer assigned to a single inhabited world. Supporters of the account say a delegate's main function is to monitor a civilization's progress against broader interstellar rules, watching for technological thresholds, collecting observational data, and relaying formal requests from local authorities if permitted by their classification status. According to the claims, delegates maintain a long-term presence in or near the planetary system, often relying on remote observational technology rather than direct, permanent integration into the local culture. Above them, the notes describe system coordinators, figures who would be responsible for every inhabited planet within a single star system. In the alleged framework, they act as system-level managers, keeping track of each world's conditions and any developments that might warrant closer observation. Even in systems without open contact worlds, these coordinators are said to watch for signs of emerging capability, such as advances in propulsion, sustained environmental management, or societal stability beyond factional conflict. Their role in the narrative is to balance the inputs from planetary delegates and to identify when a situation merits review by higher levels. A third tier appears in these depictions, adjudicators or a combined adjudicator council. This level is said to operate across multiple star systems within a sector, making rulings on disputes, clarifying ambiguous protocol situations, and ensuring consistency in interpretation of whatever guiding principles supposedly govern the network. In the alleged descriptions, adjudicators have the authority to influence decisions that carry implications for many civilizations at once, convening in assemblies when joint direction is needed. At the top of the reported chain is what some accounts call the core administrative assembly. Here, the purported function shifts from managing individual cases to maintaining what is described as the mandate of the First Order. In the small amount of whistleblower and fringe material that touches on this mandate, It is framed as keeping balance among developing civilizations, preventing premature militarization, and avoiding escalation of local disputes into wider interstellar conflicts. Whether such a body exists at all remains entirely unverified. As presented in these accounts, the structure is tied to a graded protocol system. Civilizations are placed into contact tiers, each with different rights, limitations, and conditions for advancement. The existence of such tiers is part of the same leak-based narrative, with claimed advancement criteria ranging from technological capacity, like stable interplanetary travel, to social measures, like sustained governance without collapse or prolonged interfactional war. Movement between tiers, the notes suggest, would be determined through input from delegates and coordinators, passed to adjudicators for a decision. Whistleblower release papers from late 2024, marked Internal Review, purportedly classify Earth under an observer tier. In this alleged framework, such a designation would mean some governance levels on the planet are aware of non-native civilizations, but the population at large is left without conclusive confirmation. Contact under this tier is said to occur indirectly, through signals, limited exchanges, or brief encounters, without altering the society's trajectory in ways judged destabilizing. The same alleged criteria imply that major advancements in unity and conflict resolution would be prerequisites for entering a higher contact tier. If the observer tier description were correct, it might be used to explain consistent patterns in UAP encounters reported in both public and classified contexts. Transient displays near sensitive sites, monitored but not exploited proximity to decision-making centers, and disengagement before sustained interaction. These parallels, however suggestive, remain part of a contested interpretation. No open-source evidence ties official UAP casework to such a classification system. The leaked notes, assuming they are genuine, do not give a timeline for when Earth allegedly entered this category. They claim tier status changes are assessed over decades rather than in quick cycles, and that any shift upward or downward would require sign-off from sector-level adjudicators. This aspect, like the entire supposed framework, has not been substantiated in verifiable documentation. Critics point out that without supporting material, such terms could be the product of fictionalized accounts or misinterpretation of unrelated programs. What stands out, even within the speculative descriptions, is the concentration of decision-making above the planetary level. A petition from a planet's own governance for closer integration, under this alleged system, would move slowly through multiple oversight layers, where it could be delayed, modified, or rejected. Proponents see this as evidence of a long-range stability plan. Skeptics see it as an unverifiable speculation overly dependent on trusting second-hand sources. Mainstream experts remind that elaborate hierarchies appear often in science fiction and hypothetical governance models, and that apparent complexity does not equate to authenticity. Official positions from ARRO, the Department of Defense, and NASA maintain there is no proven existence of extraterrestrial governance or technology. Without tangible, testable evidence, they argue, the alleged tier and three-level chain of authority remain imaginative constructs. Supporters of the first-order concept argue that these leaked and anecdotal accounts fit with a larger body of testimony about structured management of contact, even if the specifics vary between sources. They point to recurring themes, gradual disclosure, staged awareness, conflict avoidance strategies, as indicators of a coherent underlying model. Detractors counter that patterns can be projected onto unrelated data, and that human tendency to organize unknowns into hierarchies is not proof of their reality. Now the critical question, if such a framework exists, where is the evidence? That is the dividing line between those citing whistleblower accounts like David Grush's and those relying strictly on examined and recovered materials. On one side, narratives of intentional management and assigned roles. On the other, public statements that nothing substantiates them. This gap fuels the ongoing debate over whether to treat the First Order as a possible intelligence reality or as a constructed myth sustained by selective readings. In the available accounts, one additional idea threads through descriptions of the First Order's administrative functions, that its protocols are tailored to different categories of civilizations. The criteria for engagement, oversight, and integration are said to depend not only on technological or social progress, but also on more fundamental behavioral patterns. That aspect is where the model, if it exists, links directly to how civilizations are classified and why some worlds are monitored more closely than others. warrior-type civilizations, and why the First Order watches them closely. A recurring theme in some debrief translations and fringe interviews is the distinction between what they term warrior-type and harmonious-type civilizations, a conceptual tool that certain insiders use to explain potential risk. In this framing, the categories are not defined solely by whether a society is at war at a given moment. Instead, they are said to refer to long-term historical patterns, favored survival strategies, and the relationship between technological advancement and cycles of conflict. Harmonious-type civilizations, as described in this model, are portrayed as having developed with minimal large-scale internal wars. Their governance tends to remain stable over extended periods, with sustained emphasis on cooperative problem-solving, equitable resource use, and exploratory projects designed to bring mutual benefit. In the same materials, warrior-type civilizations follow a more conflict-marked trajectory. Their histories show recurring organized violence, competition for dominance, and rapid periods of weapons innovation driven by rival blocs. Even stable periods are often bracketed by upheaval. In the language attributed to the so-called First Order system, such recurrence is treated not as random, but as part of a foreseeable arc some species experience before achieving lasting stability. This type is considered faster to innovate under pressure, but also more prone to destabilizing early interstellar ventures by projecting internal disputes outward. According to proponents of this classification, the alleged oversight network pays closer attention to these warrior-type societies. The purpose, they say, is not to impose control or dismantle them, but to track developmental thresholds that could cause ripple effects beyond a home system. A warrior-type civilization reaching advanced propulsion or strategic capabilities without having achieved durable internal cooperation is, in this view, a risk factor for a wider region. The response described involves staged interaction intended to slow, redirect, or integrate such civilizations before they can trigger larger conflicts. This remains a theory. There is no corroboration of such practices in independent science or in ARRO's public findings. Integration, in the accounts that circulate, is gradual. Progress is measured against internal milestones like forming representative planetary governance, sharply reducing resource-driven interstate war, and demonstrating sustained cooperation in managing shared threats. At each supposed benchmark, figures occupying mid- and upper-tier roles in the first-order model reassess readiness for deeper exchange. Such exchange, if the description were accurate, might involve controlled transfers of knowledge in sustainability or defensive stability, but deliberately avoid empowering any single faction over all others. Complementing the assessment process are timed contact events, described as short-lived sightings, restricted sensor detections, or technological demonstrations calibrated to reach only leadership circles. The aim, according to these claims, is to test how decision-makers respond when confronted with controlled but undeniable anomalies. For the alleged warrior-type cases, timing is considered critical. Avoid moments when tensions are high and militarization is accelerating, and seek those intervals when cooperative sentiment is stronger following internal crises. Advocates say these calibrations can nudge outlooks toward broader stability, but again, no verifiable evidence exists to confirm that such targeting of contact takes place. Some documents attributed to internal briefings contend that active intervention is considered only when a warrior-type civilization's conflict nearly crosses planetary boundaries. For example, plans to weaponize off-world bases or disrupt shared orbital infrastructure. Intervention, they contend, may take indirect forms, disabling certain systems in a crisis, or approaching factions likely to safeguard stability once the acute threat subsides. Analysts outside these circles note that similar incidents, failed weapons tests, unexplained equipment losses, sometimes have plausible conventional explanations, including engineering faults, environmental factors, or deliberate human interference. By contrast, in this model, harmonious-type civilizations are regarded as lower risk. Their external integration can proceed sooner and with fewer restrictions, as their likelihood of projecting hostile conflict beyond their home planet is considered minimal. Warrior-type civilizations, meanwhile, are said to operate under what some accounts call containment scheduling, slowing the pace of contact and technology sharing until destabilizing ideologies fade and cooperative governance matures. From the standpoint of these transcripts and reports, Earth is framed as a warrior-type society in a transition phase. That label covers civilizations with both high technological capabilities and unresolved, active rivalries between major internal powers. The emphasis, according to sources repeating this classification, is not on a fixed outcome, but on observing which way the balance tips over decades, toward entrenched cooperation or toward more entrenched division. Recent comparative charts in the same body of material place Earth on a curve resembling other alleged warrior-type examples just prior to full integration or intensified containment. The timing of any intervention within this phase, as described, is said to be aligned with peaks in cooperative sentiment. Such periods often follow major conflicts, when the material cost of division is fresh in collective memory and leadership is more open to partnership rhetoric. Contacts, whether in the form of visible craft, unexplained phenomena, or quiet technical interference, are theorized to be more effective at those points. Contact during high-tension intervals, by contrast, is thought to strengthen defensive postures and accelerate arms development. If these accounts are accurate, the cycles themselves set the tempo for interaction. Measures might take the form of staged demonstrations near conflict zones, or the quiet neutralization of weapons systems slated for escalation. Advocates of the theory argue that the underlying aim is not ideological assimilation but preparation for eventual inclusion in a stable, multi-system environment. Skeptics, including quoted scientists in the background research, caution that such interpretations depend heavily on unverifiable sources. They also stress that many UAP events attributed to calibration could be explained by misidentified aircraft, atmospheric effects, drones, or foreign reconnaissance platforms. Those promoting the theory point to historical correlations between moments of reduced global tension and clusters of notable sightings or unexplained system failures. The same pattern, they suggest, is visible in select recent cases, seeing them as timed engagements rather than random incidents. Critics counter that the sample sizes are small, the correlation unproven, and the pattern possibly coincidental, a common product of retrofitting data to a preferred narrative. Leaked evaluation notes from late 2024, if authentic, name several periods in the modern era when Earth's collective posture met the criteria for such contact under the warrior-type model. In many of those intervals, documented aerial or orbital anomalies did occur, though whether any were intentionally placed is entirely speculative. For supporters of the model, these alignments are examples of the oversight system at work. For detractors, they are a mix of coincidence and normal geopolitical fluctuations overlaid with unverified assumptions. Ultimately, within this conceptual framework, Earth's current position is described as a decisive stretch. Whether that description holds any truth will depend on outcomes no document can yet confirm. What is clear is that even as this model remains contested, it frames the planet not as an isolated case, but as one among many civilizations thought to be observed in a similar fashion. That perspective inevitably raises a larger question about the supposed scale of such oversight, and how far this influence, if it exists, might extend beyond our own system. What the numbers reveal about their reach. In restricted discussions about the scale of first-order oversight, different sources and whistleblowers give widely different estimates for how many inhabited systems could be under protocol. Public claims, leaked material, and interview accounts vary so much that their ranges cannot be reconciled. Some speak of dozens, others of numbers several times larger, but no independently confirmed figure exists. Any count of inhabited systems under protocol remains speculative. Open, peer-reviewable evidence has not been published. What is clearer is how analysts say such estimates are built. They piece together patterns from repeated observational signatures, sequences of contact-type events around certain stars, intercepted signal anomalies on consistent frequencies, and routine shifts in orbital traffic that align with known calibration periods. When these indicators recur, they are treated by some as signs that a system is subject to coordinated rules. Open-source astronomy has flagged a few of these cases, yet the more precise pattern matching depends on deep space monitoring equipment that is not part of civilian networks. Historical notes and leaked briefings claim that this type of coordinated footprint was first recognized sometime in the mid-20th century, when only a few dozen systems appeared to fit the expected profile. Those early detections coincided with an increase in structured aerial observations near Earth, suggesting the planet was entering comparable oversight. By the late 1980s, the internal tallies in these narratives showed steady growth. Gaps in monitoring then meant the numbers almost certainly skewed low. Later improvements in long-range imaging and narrowband listening through the 1990s and 2000s allowed for continuous study of more systems. This, combined with events timed against cultural or technological milestones in local populations, reinforce the perception of a structured timetable. The collection of worlds thought to be involved, if these claims are correct, expanded gradually, with new candidates identified as data filled in. Those same briefings describe the imagined network not as an even scatter, but as arcs radiating from certain hubs. Each hub is said to coordinate nearby inhabited systems, some with more advanced contact and others still in early observation stages. Earth, in this portrayal, lies within one such cluster. The reach is presented as strategic, not random, growth traced along migration routes, influence corridors, or selected anchor points. Where unclassified charts depict scattered, isolated points, descriptions from classified environments talk of denser overlays. These overlays allegedly fill in the quiet zones of the public maps with dozens more points and thin connective lines to key systems. For analysts without access, the visual is condensed to a single comparison. Classified layers supposedly paint a busier picture than authorized charts, but those layers come from leaks and whistleblower claims, not official releases. Analysts who give weight to the larger estimates argue that many points in these overlays fall beyond regions routinely scanned by human-aligned assets. That would mean protocol coverage stretching into areas invisible to our current instruments and Earth, considered only one case among many. In that frame, our classification is just a small data entry in a much larger operational ledger. The dynamics inside this speculative framework also factor in changes over time. A newly added world might stay in a purely observational stage for decades before entering limited exchange. Another could lose contact status during extended instability, resuming only when the situation met agreed thresholds. Such transitions are rarely claimed to be abrupt. They are shown in long arcs, shaping the charted growth rate. One challenge in visualizing any scenario involving hundreds of counterparts is scale. For context, within our own confirmed field of UAP tracking, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office logged 757 new reports between May 1, 2023 and June 1, 2024, bringing its cumulative total to 1,652 as of June 2024. Of those, 21 cases merited extended analysis. If a system-level network like the one described in these claims existed, our planet's entry in that sort of registry would be a statistical sliver compared to the case load handled globally for just this one world. For the alleged oversight model to manage many times that number of systems, the same sources say responsibilities are often delegated. Local member civilizations, the ones that have matured through the protocol's higher tiers, could monitor nearby younger worlds, following a shared schedule but making operational adjustments for regional conditions. Central coordination would still exist, they claim, to set synchronized review windows and long-term policy. Pattern reviews of the supposed network note that systems in the same sector often register contact type or calibration events within tight time bands. Supporters see this as evidence that the oversight effort runs on a central operational calendar. Even if actions take place under local authority, the schedule appears coordinated. Those who study the political implications highlight that the size of the network, whatever the actual count, changes the frame of any decision affecting Earth. It would not be a bilateral consideration between us and a single controlling body, but one weighed in a multi-world queue alongside others' readiness, regressions, and sensitivities. That larger context could influence whether our timetable accelerates, holds steady, or pauses. Skeptics stress the absence of demonstrable evidence for any of these numerical projections. Without confirmed detection of such hubs and arcs, the maps remain hypothetical. Detailed, verifiable charts have not been entered into peer-reviewed literature, and no official investigation has endorsed the range claimed by whistleblowers. The interpretation of recurring observational patterns as signs of governance remains disputed. Even so, the idea of scale survives in discussion. For proponents, it conveys that if such a body exists at all, its area of awareness is incomparably larger than our own, and the rules we experience are a small subset of a broader structure. To detractors, it illustrates how easily unverified data points can be stitched into an impressive-looking but untested narrative. This unresolved question leaves analysts looking not only at spatial extent, but also at pacing. If the network is real, how does it decide when to move a civilization from one stage to another? Some point to timing indicators that appear to align with markers more subtle than technology or governance. They speak of behavioral and cultural thresholds, patterns in how a population interacts with itself and its environment, as possible determinants in the schedule. So if the numbers themselves remain hidden, the search shifts toward the signals that might reveal a civilization's place in the line, and why its window for contact opens when it does. Many believe that to understand this cycle, you have to look beyond infrastructure and politics, into the deeper layers of what shapes a planet's capacity to engage at all. Linking contact protocols to consciousness evolution. Some strategic frameworks described in leaked documents, whistleblower briefings, and long-circulated fringe transcripts propose that the timing of interplanetary contact is not governed solely by technical readiness or political stability. Instead, these narratives tie it to indicators of collective consciousness within a planet's dominant intelligent species, a controversial and non-standard metric outside esoteric and ufology circles. In this hypothesis, the protocols of a body like the First Order serve two purposes: managing stability during contact and aligning that engagement with moments when a civilization's shared mental and perceptual capacity supposedly reaches a set threshold. Within this model, a key concept appears repeatedly, so-called harmonic or level 4 consciousness. The way it is presented in fringe literature and whistleblower claims, this level means cooperative, planetary-scale decision-making has become the prevailing mode. Conflict and competition would still exist, but patterns of cooperation would consistently outweigh destructive behaviors. Advocates of this idea argue that contact should be escalated only once such socio-psychological conditions are in place, so that external engagement is interpreted as part of an existing cooperative momentum rather than as a destabilizing intrusion. Similar conscious evolution concepts have appeared in modern theosophical and systems thinking literature, which frames major leaps in coordination as inflection points in a species' development. In this view, the lower stages of consciousness describe different baseline modes of collective behavior. Stage 1 is individual self-awareness. Stage 2 shows sustained cooperation within large groups or states. Stage 3 reflects recognition of long-term shared survival interests. And Stage 4 signals that a cooperative planetary orientation has become the dominant pattern. The descriptions are qualitative, not uniform across sources, and remain far from any standardized or peer-reviewed taxonomy. Proponents point to adoption of global governance frameworks, long-term problem-solving agreements, and shared resource management as markers of the shift. Leaked projection tables tied to this framework, if genuine, place humanity's probable transition to level 4 somewhere between 2030 and 2035, a much shorter horizon than earlier estimates that counted in centuries. The adjustment is attributed to rapid technological interconnection, accelerated cross-cultural exchange, and faster collaborative problem-solving. Even in those documents, the number is framed as a probability range, not an inevitability, and dependent on avoiding destabilizing reversals. Supporters within these circles often cite correlations between global cooperative peaks and observable spikes in credible UAP events. Alleged internal chart packages span more than 70 years of data and plot upticks in sightings, sensor captures, and other recordings against periods of heightened planetary focus on shared objectives. These peaks do not align exclusively with peace. They also appear during intensive crisis response efforts, joint scientific milestones, or cultural moments reaching large portions of the population at once. In this interpretation, such alignments are operationally significant. The charts, according to those familiar with them, show that larger surges in UAP visibility tend to follow within months of notable shifts in collective outlook. For example, breakthroughs in communications infrastructure connecting disparate regions, or unprecedented international agreements. The suggestion is that these windows represent points at which a society can absorb more direct interaction without defaulting to defensive reactions. Missing such a window, say proponents, could mean a delay of many years before conditions improve again. Applied to current projections for Earth, this reasoning casts the early 2030s as a high-stakes interval. Advocates believe that if human civilization can sustain the patterns associated with Level 4, it will remove the strongest arguments for keeping the planet at a lower contact tier. They anticipate contact scaling that is incremental and carefully managed, enough to be broadly noticed, but short of overwhelming existing systems, tapering as the new collective baseline stabilizes. In this framework, Level 4 is not regarded as the signal for immediate public, open exchange. Instead, it would allow a shift into deeper integration within the administrative structures described in first-order lore, with larger political and technical exchanges considered safer to attempt. A key premise is that once a civilization operates mostly from cooperative reflexes on the planetary scale, risks like militarizing alien technology against its own kind or destabilizing its political order are reduced. Fringe sources also highlight cases where civilizations appeared to near the harmonic mark, only to regress into more factional or competitive behavior. These, they claim, resulted in delays in further contact for decades. Observers applying this model to Earth warn that our history shows alternating movement toward cooperation and backsliding into rivalry, making the stability of any coming shift as important as its timing. Proponents frame consciousness evolution here as a practical rather than mystical measure, a gauge of readiness to engage with external parties on matters no one internal faction can resolve alone. They argue that from a strategic management standpoint, it is easier to integrate a civilization when it is primed to interpret such integration as beneficial, rather than as a challenge to its divisions. The corollary is that introducing a still-fractured society could export its disputes outward, with destabilizing consequences for any wider network. Critics from more orthodox backgrounds caution against giving such weight to an abstract and hard-to-measure factor. Scientists like Adam Frank and Sean Carroll, whose public commentary regularly addresses claims about extraterrestrial life and contact, argue that without transparent methods, verifiable data, and testable predictions, frameworks based on consciousness-level risk drifting into metaphysics rather than actionable policy. They note that measurable socioeconomic indicators already exist for cooperation, stability, and resilience, and that these can be tied directly to observed outcomes, whereas correlating UAP activity with a supposed planetary mindset involves multiple speculative steps. Even granting the possibility of a consciousness-linked progression, there is no consensus on how such an attribute would be measured remotely by an outside observer, or how closely it would track real-world decision-making in moments of stress. Critics also question whether selective interpretation of historical events could be biasing the chart patterns that proponents find meaningful. Advocates counter that even without formal recognition, the model offers predictive value for those managing staggered contact. They claim the broad correlation between cooperative surges and increased calibrated activity provides at least a working heuristic for timing non-disruptive engagement. The absence of open validation is attributed to the classified nature of the data and, in some cases, to the reluctance of officials to admit shaping policy around a variable associated with esoteric belief systems. Where the debate leaves off is with a shared acknowledgement that socio-political conditions matter in any form of contact scenario, whether one frames that in terms of governance stability, crisis management, or collective awareness. From there, proponents and skeptics diverge sharply. For one side, consciousness evolution is the deeper current shaping readiness. For the other, it's an unproven overlay on top of more concrete indicators. If the model holds, the closing years before a predicted harmonic shift would invite choices from both inside and outside the civilization in question about whether to use that period to prepare for more sustained interaction. Observers in these circles suggest such a phase may already be underway for Earth, implying that stakeholders, whatever their origin, are watching for cooperative patterns as much as for technical milestones. Some within the intelligence analysis community claim that, true or not, ideas like this influence how certain monitoring entities set priorities. The emphasis on collective alignment as a trigger point can shape not only when engagement is stepped up, but also where and in what form it is applied. And that perspective leads directly into a question of what objectives those observers might be pursuing in the present, an issue that has lately drawn fresh attention from a source with long-standing access to compartmented defense work. Recent whistleblower claims about their mission on Earth. In mid-2024, new attention was drawn to claims from a figure who had already made headlines the previous year. David Grush, a former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer who served with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, had in 2023 testified publicly before Congress that the U.S. government possessed retrieved non-human spacecraft, associated materials, and what he described as non-human biologics. His allegations extended to covert reverse engineering programs hidden within compartmented defense projects. These statements circulated widely in the press and in congressional hearings, prompting formal denials from the Department of Defense and the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. both of which reiterated that their investigations had found no evidence of extraterrestrial beings, activity, or technology. By 2024, according to individuals citing Grush's closed-door briefings, his narrative expanded to include details about what he described as a shift in the way Earth was being managed by an external oversight network. In his telling, and in similar accounts from unnamed insiders in related channels, the long-standing status of Earth as a monitored but largely non-interfered with world had begun to change. The label sometimes attached to this alleged change was stabilization operations. This, they claimed, was not a military occupation or direct rule, but a series of limited, deliberate interventions intended to head off fast-moving crises before they could escalate beyond the planet and affect other civilizations in the same notional sector. In these accounts, stabilization refers to situations assessed as having the potential to trigger sector-wide instability, a chain reaction where events on one planet destabilize others with which it has no direct contact. The example given in various retellings is a localized military confrontation that starts a rapid geopolitical reshuffling, drawing in multiple alliances and altering strategic calculations far beyond its starting point. Managing such developments, according to the allegation, is a key part of the First Order's risk model. Those conveying this view describe interventions aimed at high-risk points rather than at every visible crisis. The testimony mentions hotspots where internal monitoring data, not public feeds, showed unidentified aerial phenomena appearing close to strategic infrastructure at moments of heightened alert. In some cases, electromagnetic disturbances reportedly disrupted communications, or anomalies were tracked in airspace just ahead of planned deployments. Subsequent timelines for those areas, they said, showed subtle changes, orders paused, negotiations reopened, or operational deadlines pushed back. The implication in these briefings was that such shifts were not accidents, but the results of targeted, short-term actions from above. According to these allegations, the operations are sparing and reactive. Assets, whatever their form, are positioned in advance where intelligence markers suggest a significant development is approaching. Indicators could be unusual activity in encrypted streams, rapid repositioning of military platforms, or sudden movements by senior decision-makers. In the proposed model, that forward positioning allows quick responses without revealing the operator's presence or triggering suspicion. The goal, these sources claim, is to let domestic actors perceive the changed outcomes as the result of their own choices or chance events, rather than as effects of outside intervention. In this framing, the choice of where to act is based on the potential for cascading instability, not the purely human scale of the conflict. A small but tightly interlinked territorial dispute can be more dangerous in this context than a large but self-contained war. The risk analysis in the alleged documentation emphasizes how certain fault lines can connect unexpected regions, making them more likely to transmit destabilizing effects far afield and forcing decisions in other monitored systems. Some who repeat these accounts say the move toward more active stabilization began in the early 2020s, though no public evidence fixes an exact point. In their version, prior decades were marked mainly by so-called calibration events, timed appearances to measure readiness, followed by long gaps. The change they allege now marks a mandate shift, with stability management given more priority than passive observation. None of this has been corroborated in open sources, and no official agency has acknowledged implementing such an intervention model. Tied to these claims is the idea of a coming contact window, a defined period during which Earth's status in the oversight framework could be reassessed. In the whistleblower narratives, this window is projected for 2026. Advancement to a higher tier of engagement, they say, would depend on evidence of sustained cooperation at the global level. The escalation in known flashpoints, ongoing cross-national initiatives that solve practical problems, and avoidance of uncontrolled large-scale conflict during the lead-up. The same sources warn that falling short would not close the window entirely, but would make an upgrade unlikely for decades. The internal process described for such a change follows the hierarchy already attributed, without proof, to the First Order model. A planetary delegate would assemble the records since stabilization began. A system coordinator would review it, and only if those marks were met would the case go before sector-level adjudicators. Grush's account does not supply proof that this process exists, and no independent access to such reviews has been documented. Alleged brief excerpts shared in advocacy circles add another layer, describing the preference for civilizations to stabilize themselves without hidden help. By this logic, stabilization campaigns are temporary measures, designed to preserve a planet's eligibility for a well-timed engagement opportunity. If stability appears robust without unseen corrections, reviewers can argue more forcefully to move that world along to the next interaction tier. If not, the same covert containment may continue, or, in the more pessimistic readings, additional constraints could be applied. Across these accounts, the next 2 years are described as unusually consequential. The whistleblowers' framing positions present geopolitical choices as relevant not only to human outcomes, but to an external ledger of readiness. In this interpretation, the overseer structure is weighing Earth's demonstrated ability to sustain equilibrium as part of a broader network's timeline. Mainstream reaction to these claims has been pointed. Physicist and astrobiology researcher Adam Frank has reiterated that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, stressing that anecdote and classified briefings are not substitutes for public, verifiable data. Physicist Sean Carroll has called the evidence for non-human craft retrievals laughable, absent the kind of incontrovertible smoking gun that could withstand skeptical scientific and intelligence scrutiny. Other officials and scientists have publicly urged caution, pointing out that many dramatic allegations in this domain have collapsed under closer examination or remain unverifiable decades later. The Department of Defense and ARRO, in direct response to Grush's 2023 congressional testimony, stated they had found no evidence of extraterrestrial beings, activity, or technology, and no proof of any retrieval or reverse engineering programs hidden from oversight. They have also reaffirmed that none of the unresolved UAP cases in their purview meet the threshold for establishing non-human origin. These statements remain the official position despite continued circulation of the stabilization narrative in fringe and whistleblower-friendly outlets. For viewers, the current state is straightforward: an allegation from a named whistleblower, denials from the responsible agencies, and sharply differing views from subject matter experts. What cannot be resolved here is the truth of the operational picture he describes, but the presence of these claims, and the way they echo other disputed historical material, is adding pressure to a conversation that until recently was more easily dismissed. So we have an allegation, an official denial, and expert skepticism. Next we examine why leaked language and historical echoes have made this debate more combustible, and what that might mean practically. Why 2025's leaks change the stakes entirely. By 2023 to 2024, 3 distinct lines of information began to be compared in a way that had not often happened before. One came from historical transcripts and fringe interview material, including the disputed EBA1 interpreter notes from the late 1940s and early 1950s. Another was the ARRO FY24 cycle, May 1, 2023 through June 1, 2024, which contained public case summaries, official imagery reviews, and technical re-evaluations of well-known incidents such as Go Fast and Gimbal. The third came from recent whistleblower claims, including David Grush's 2023 congressional testimony alleging non-human craft recovery and biologics. Each stream is contentious in its own way. Only one draws from officially acknowledged investigation, but where they overlap on language, operational concepts, or patterns of activity across decades, analysts tend to take notice. That alignment, viewed from an intelligence assessment perspective, is not treated as proof. The Department of Defense and ARRO have reiterated there is no evidence of extraterrestrial beings, activity, or technology in any of their casework. Scientists like Adam Frank underscore that such material still needs transparent, forensic-level validation before it can be integrated into accepted models. Sean Carroll has likewise warned that anecdote or fragile sourcing is no substitute for an evidentiary record that could withstand close scientific and intelligence scrutiny. What makes the current comparison unusual is its specificity. Across the 3 streams, certain phrases and frameworks recur: contact tiers, strategic calibration events, and references to a multi-level administrative structure spread across inhabited systems. When historic notes, formal government phrasing, and insider testimony use the same narrow terminology, that is enough for some specialists to move the idea from fringe hypothesis to working hypothesis. But they stress that this shift in category does not bypass the need for verifiable material evidence. Without it, the model remains provisional. The historical side of that comparison, for those willing to treat the EBA1 material as at least partially authentic, shows interpreters recording the subject's descriptions of oversight councils, defined zones of contact authority, and chains of decision-making above the planetary level. Large portions were redacted before any public release. In modern official language from the FY24 ARRO report, while there is no direct acknowledgement of those themes, a phrase like administrative mechanism inevitably draws attention from those already aware of the earlier terms. It is a tenuous link, but for some, repetition of structurally similar language in a vetted public document is enough to warrant sustained attention. Then there is the whistleblower track. Grush's public statements were about alleged retrievals and covert programs, but in closed briefings, his and others' accounts have reportedly referenced the same concepts: tiered contact categories, stabilization missions in specific regions, and a delegate coordinator adjudicator hierarchy managing planetary progression. Without independent access to those briefings, outside observers can only match the claimed details to what appears in other environments and note the congruence. For professional analysts, this is what amounts to a triangulation. Sources separated by decades, compiled in unrelated contexts, turning out material that, at least on the surface, reinforces one another. The effect is to encourage deeper modeling, scenario planning, and question setting that take the possibility of an organized structure seriously without declaring it confirmed. In government or contracted research roles, even an unproven working hypothesis can influence how future cases are categorized and which indicators are tracked more closely. That, in turn, influences the kinds of questions policymakers begin to ask. If such an administrative system existed, would national and international law have analogs at that level? Could any human, or institutional, decision alter our classification within it? Inside certain policy discussions, the idea is explored not as doctrine, but as contingency. What if future evidence were judged sufficient and public acknowledgement became unavoidable? What interoperability gaps between terrestrial and theoretical non-terrestrial procedures would have to be closed? One short passage in materials said to have circulated in late 2024 illustrates this mindset. It mentions preliminary discussion of how existing international treaty law might be brought into alignment with anticipated external administrative statutes, with formal recognition of supraplanetary legal authority as a scenario in which those preparations would be relevant. The authenticity of that excerpt cannot be confirmed outside closed channels, but even as an unverified sample, it reflects a different attitude than one of pure dismissal. Viewed that way, the conversation is not just about whether a first-order type framework is real, but about how humans might function politically, diplomatically, and operationally if it turned out to be. For proponents of the hypothesis, the act of preparing compatible procedures could, if observed by an external authority, signal readiness for deeper engagement. For critics, it is a thought experiment without evidentiary grounding, useful only insofar as it tests existing assumptions. For the public record, the tension remains. In open literature, there is no sustained, peer-reviewed demonstration that any of these terms or structures have an external origin. In narrower circles, the fact that they appear from such different vectors, Cold War-era files, modern case reports, and insider allegation, keeps the theory alive. The distinction is critical. Alignment of themes is an analytical signal, but it is not itself the evidentiary threshold. That threshold, as experts have described, would require specific forms of proof. Material artifacts subjected to independent laboratory analysis and found to be of non-terrestrial manufacture would meet it. Reproducible sensor footage with multi-point radar, optical, and infrared data time-stamped and cross-verified by multiple operators would strengthen it substantially. Multi-agency declassification of complete, primary source documents detailing the chain of acquisition and analysis could satisfy it in the documentary domain. These are tangible benchmarks, the kind Adam Frank has argued must be met for any extraordinary claim to move into accepted fact, and that Sean Carroll and others identify as the only way to separate compelling stories from established reality. Having those benchmarks in mind clarifies what current convergence can and cannot tell us. It can suggest lines of priority for monitoring, highlight recurring operational language, and frame hypothetical scenarios for decision-makers to test against emerging data. It cannot stand alone as proof that an external administrative hierarchy is guiding contact or policy from beyond Earth. Still, in practical terms, the effect of such comparisons is cumulative. With each new official report, historic file release, or whistleblower account that reuses the same operational vocabulary. The hypothesis gains more traction among those already inclined to consider it. That incremental shift can alter how certain agencies log incidents, how international forums frame cooperation on anomalous phenomena, and how military or research schedules are arranged to capture better data in real time. For those outside these spheres, the significance may simply be that the idea is no longer confined to informal conversation. When elements of it are discussed in the same decision support contexts as more traditional security or policy risks, it gains a different status. At that point, the remaining question is less about whether anyone in authority privately believes it, and more about what impact the working hypothesis has on day-to-day choices. It is in the gap between hypothesis and proof that the stakes change. The moment a possibility informs the allocation of resources, the drafting of contingency plans, or the quiet shaping of bipartisan policy language, it is influencing real-world outcomes, even without public proclamation. And because the frameworks being discussed imply actors and jurisdictions well beyond our own, any shift in their status has the potential to reframe how leaders think about security, governance, and the scope of the human role within a larger order. That broader consideration opens directly into the next, less abstract issue: the kinds of concrete changes that would follow if such a network were treated as a governing reality rather than an unproven model. Practical implications for humanity's future. If the existence of an off-world administrative network were ever formally acknowledged, and if it became accepted that such a system had ongoing oversight of when and how contact takes place, the effects on human institutions could be wide-ranging. In governance, law, defense, science, and education, it would not just be a matter of information disclosure. The question would shift to how existing frameworks adapt to an additional layer of authority beyond our planet. Under current arrangements, the baseline for governing activity in space is set by the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which binds its signatories to avoid claiming sovereignty over celestial bodies, prohibits certain weapons deployments, and promotes space use for peaceful purposes. As it stands, no higher external jurisdiction is recognized. If formal recognition of any structured interstellar body occurred, we would need to reconcile terrestrial law and establish treaties with whatever binding requirements such an authority might impose. That process would be slow, complicated, and politically contested, hinging on who has the right to represent the planet in such negotiations and how terrestrial sovereignty would interact with external statutes. The governance question would go beyond adapting laws. It would require looking closely at representation. The United Nations can act as a coordinating forum, but lacks the mandate to govern for all nations in matters of defense or resource control. If an off-world administration required a single point of contact, we would face the decision of empowering an existing institution or creating something entirely new, each choice raising issues of legitimacy, accountability, and global political balance. In the realm of defense and security, military planning has long assumed that hazards are either human in origin or natural, like meteor strikes. Acknowledgement of an external authority with enforcement power over certain activities, such as restrictions on weapons testing, satellite deployment, or off-world military infrastructure, would force a reprioritization. We already see institutions adapting in small but visible ways. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office has called for better sensor coverage and data sharing between agencies to improve monitoring of unidentified phenomena. Measures like adjusting sensor allocations or redirecting budgets toward shared defensive arrangements are examples of how such adaptation could proceed under defined external rules. Science and education would also face near-term practical changes. Agencies like NASA are participating in workshops, such as those run in conjunction with the Night Science Journalism program, to prepare journalists for accurately reporting potential discoveries of life beyond Earth. This indicates an awareness that public information and outreach will have to evolve if contact scenarios move from hypothetical to actual policy. Canada's Sky Canada project has recommended establishing a federal body to centralize and standardize UAP reporting, reflecting a broader trend toward integrating data collection across disciplines and agencies. Religious traditions may be drawn into fresh discussions as well, not necessarily to change doctrine, but to interpret how the existence of other intelligent civilizations and their governance systems fits into long-standing views of humanity's role in creation. Since religion shapes ethical perspectives in policy, education, and law, emerging interpretations could influence decisions far beyond theological boundaries. Public identity would inevitably shift. At present, human progress is measured against our own historical achievements and challenges. Seeing ourselves as one player in a larger, inhabited network would push that perspective outward. Milestones like global internet coverage or orbital stations, while monumental here, might be understood as common steps on a shared trajectory toward higher levels of interstellar engagement. This could inspire new priorities focused on cooperative stability, but it might also fuel resistance from those who reject external influence over Earth's direction. Economically, adherence to externally defined stability protocols could require limits on certain industries, extraction practices, or experimentation in order to qualify for more favorable engagement status. The short-term cost of restructuring could be offset by controlled access to technologies or knowledge that accelerate sustainable development, if such exchanges were part of the arrangement. Culturally, knowledge of a broader governance framework could strengthen cross-cultural collaboration by fostering a shared planetary identity. It could also generate backlash from communities that see any external regulation as a threat to autonomy or tradition. Balancing the potential loss of local control with the benefits of integration would be an ongoing source of social and political tension. Education might be one of the most direct instruments of change. Curricula could expand to position human history within the context of a populated galaxy, introducing concepts like contact tiers, oversight structures, and the responsibilities that accompany participation in a multi-system network. Presenting these ideas early could shape how upcoming generations of leaders view both domestic governance and planetary representation. If such an administrative presence operates today, even informally, its influence could already be visible. Agreements limiting the militarization of space, multilateral scientific projects framed as benefiting all humanity, and recurring calls for increased global data sharing on anomalous phenomena all align with behaviors that would be encouraged under a stability-first oversight model. Some of these patterns might have natural explanations in globalization, but they would appear much the same if quietly nudged from outside. Recognizing that influence would be complex. For most people, its signs would be indistinguishable from the normal evolution of international cooperation. Incremental policy shifts, negotiated compromises, and slow alignment of priorities toward common goals. It is only when patterns are viewed against the hypothesis of deliberate external stabilization that they take on a different potential meaning. If society did reach consensus that such shaping was deliberate, debates would intensify over transparency and consent. Supporters might argue that guidance aimed at maximizing stability and cooperative progress serves mutual interests, especially if it leads toward greater access to scientific and technological resources. Opponents could frame it as interference regardless of the outcome, pressing for policies designed to maintain complete independence. Even without drawing conclusions, the adoption of a longer-range view would begin to influence planning. Resource policy, security posture, and diplomatic strategy would be weighed not just for immediate impact, but for how they reflect on Earth's readiness to participate in a larger system, judged by criteria beyond our current political norms. Many governments are already making small but tangible moves that could fit either a purely human agenda or one aligned with external oversight. The Sky Canada project's call for a unified national reporting foundation, ARRO's push for integrated sensor data, and NASA's participation in training communicators for breakthroughs in life detection all show adaptation is underway in response to ambiguous but persistent unknowns. These are not declarations of contact, but they demonstrate that policy and science are preparing for scenarios that only a few years ago were considered remote. If such preparation reflects more than domestic precaution, if it is happening in response to quiet expectations from beyond, then the path ahead may already be set in motion. Regardless of what drives it, the outcome will be shaped by how humans choose to engage with the possibility of structured involvement in a wider community. And it is within that choice that the near future could take a decisive turn, not just in policy, but in how we understand our place within a much larger frame. If the administrative framework described in certain transcripts and whistleblower accounts exists, it would imply decades of quiet, structured engagement. But that remains a possibility, not a proven history. Verified data from ARRO, such as the FY24 report totals and unresolved cases, sit alongside extraordinary but unconfirmed narratives about the First Order and the EBA1 materials. Decide for yourself. Weigh the verified numbers against the allegations, and tell us in the comments which piece you think should be investigated next. This is a story about evidence, language, and decisions, and how a few words in an official document can change the conversation for everyone. Which side of that change will we be on?